forget how Zach put it, a German bootleg of Bram Stoker, an unauthorized edition of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Uh, it is a very different film, or a very different adaptation. However, one of the things that I always find fascinating. I am a cultural historian, and so film for me is not just something I love, but it's also quite literally an artifact of history. If you want to get into, what a society values, what they fear, horror film, watch their movies. So I'm going to start this off with a little quote from a guy who, those of you who are my students, hi, I quote a lot, Antonio Gramsci. In the early 30s, Antonio Gramsci is writing in a prison cell in fascist Italy and says, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to become now." Oops. Ooh, now is the time of monsters. What is this new world that Gramsci is talking about? What are these monsters? Uh, this new world emerging out of an old world is the aftermath of World War One. World War One is the most important event in modern history, and really ushered in the end of the 19th and for me the start of the 20th century. For me, the 20th century really starts with the First World War. The First World War is that violent break, that violent cut. World War One also gave us the horror film. And this isn't a unique thesis by me. David Skal, who wasn't even a trained historian in the 1980s, wrote a book where his essential thesis was, look, horror pictures, horror films are the ways in which societies deal with trauma. And so mainstream films, they don't touch these things. So watch people's B pictures, right? Because we invent monsters effectively to talk about all the really scary stuff we don't want to talk about. And the First World War gave us modern horror cinema. Indeed, the first zombie film. Has anyone ever seen Abel Grance's 1919 film J'accuse? It's a crazy movie. It's really short, and you can find it on YouTube too. Uh, it is literally this film dealing with the war and the trauma of the war, uh, where the French war dead quite literally rise from the dead. In fact, he got guys right from the front to play dead French soldiers. Right, and in the 1920s, Hollywood, you have the Todd Browning, Lon Chaney films, which incidentally all deal with some form of disfiguration, like guys that are all muffed up. Geez, World War One, all of the casualties, modern warfare, people that would have died, just less than a century earlier are now coming home. What are these films really talking about, right? And of course, the films out of post war Germany, the early Weimar Republic, uh, which we just watched an example of. The war and its impact can't be underestimated in terms of this film. Because even though this is an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula and it shares some of those themes, I would argue that its specific setting, its time and place, alters those themes in some ways. Uh, the most obvious is right at the beginning of the film with the title card. I don't know if you guys noticed this. Right after the credits roll, it's like you're about to see the Great Death. All right, what is that hearkening to? Well, it's hearkening to events that had occurred quite literally just a few years earlier. And in the case of Germany, but not just Germany, most of Central and Eastern Europe, World War One doesn't end nice and neatly in 1918. The war, in a very real way, is still going on. Be it the ideologically driven civil war between the far right and the far left in Germany. The fact that you have this eastern frontier with a newly, reborn Poland, yay Poland, right, which no one's really happy about, right, neither the Germans nor the Poles. It's an economic, it's a political basket case. And so, the trauma of the conflict and the immediate post-war years are very real. And it needs to be stressed here, too. In the case of Germany, the war ends, and the war ends in defeat, but it doesn't really kind of feel like defeat, right? There's no, big battle at the end of the war where the Germans lose. In fact, on the Eastern Front, more about that in a second, the Germans are very successful. They end the war with this huge, effectively colonial empire stretching from Poland all the way to European Russia. In the West, yeah, 1918 doesn't go very well, but there's still an occupation in Belgium. There's still an occupation in France. The war ends rather, you know, uh, dramatically in 1918 when a series of strikes, bread riots, and ultimately a naval mutiny transforms itself into a revolution, and, the war ends. So, early 20s Germany, it's back to the Gramsci quote, very rarely this is a new world. And so you get the proliferation of horror films, and this being one of them. Uh, Another thing which is really important here in terms of linking the film to the war is this notion of, and I briefly mentioned this, the Eastern Front and the East. Has anyone ever read Stoker's original novel? A couple of you have. If you really break Stoker's novel down to its bare essence, it is kind of xenophobia on steroids. You have this evil, despotic person from the East who comes to nice little Britain, center of the empire that the sun never set upon, nation of shopkeepers. And his plan is to transform it into some weird oriental despotism. And oh yes, sleep with all your white women, screw up your racial superiority, and transform, this ordered, pure country into this land of chaos. This myth of the East, which was just in Great Britain, it also existed in Germany, and it predates World War One. And for Germany, its East, its Orient, quite literally was the eastern part of the country, which was effectively Western Poland, and the lands of the Russian Empire. So would today be Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, etc. So you have Stoker's original source material, which is kind of xenophobe. Then you add these other sort of German layers to it. So in the German imagination, civilization, or as they called it, Kultur, right? The German sense of self was based around this notion of Kultur, which they thought was different from civilization, which was British, French, but civilization was, well, civilized, but it was also like decadent, like the French just really care about like revolution and making this, sick artwork, and the British are just a bunch of shopkeepers. We Germans, we are ordered, we are organized, we are a race of, and they sort of framed it in very racial terms, we are a race of soldiers and philosophers. So that's Western Europe. They're like us, but they're different. Then there's just to the east. They called it Unkultur, which literally translates to lack of culture. Indeed, and I can use this word. All those Polak jokes you heard, about a bunch of me screwed and our inability to screw in light bulbs, most of them actually come from Germany. These stereotypes of once you hit the east, it was a land of backwardness, of disease, which is important here, and a land of despotism and chaos. Kultur, Germany, nice, ordered. The East, dysfunctional, ungovernable, filthy, disgusting, disorganized. These tropes, these stereotypes had existed in Germany at least since the 18th century, once you get the birth of German nationalism, right? Because national identity is simply constructed. And so when you construct yourselves, usually you have to construct another. And so for the Germans, it was, broadly speaking, Eastern Europe. World War I takes these stereotypes and transforms them and radicalizes them in new and unusual ways. So, for example, when the Germans enter Eastern Europe during the First World War, some of these stereotypes seem to get confirmed, right? This notion of backwardness. So when the Germans enter Poland in 19... By the way, those of you who know anything about the First World War in Eastern Europe, it can be summed up really easily. When the Russians fight either the Austrians or the Turks, they do well. Whenever the Germans are there, they lose. End of story. So when the Germans enter Poland in 1915, following the Germans are these, lack of a better term, carriers of culture. Because the Germans assume that this is a primitive place to begin with. We have a job to do. We have to modernize it. And the way the Germans spoke about Poland and Eastern Europe in general is eerily similar how America spoke about the frontier, how the British spoke about India, how the French spoke about Algeria. They saw this as colonial space. And so when the Germans come in, you have, these culture workers, teachers, etc., to teach up these primitive, childlike people, right? And also, even though I'm Polish, one of my relatives was in the German army, and he was something called a Blitzmensch, a lightning man, which I know sounds like some crazy Teutonic superhero. But in fact, they were there to electrify Poland. Now, here's the sick joke. Poland was electrified before the war. The war had been fought there, and therefore there's no electricity. But again, this just confirms these pre-existing stereotypes. Look at these Poles. Look at this, toilet bowl that they live in, etc. So, the war enhances these stereotypes. And if you watch the film closely, these stereotypes creep in, right? Because in the German mindset, Eastern Europe is a land lost in time. When our hero, Herr Hutter, Jonathan Harker from the novel, is given his marching papers, he's like, I'm off to Transylvania, Eastern Europe, the land of thieves and ghosts, right? Germany, land of culture, Transylvania, thieves and ghosts. So the war heightened these stereotypes, but the war also created a lot of anxieties because it's in the East during the war where you also get the Russian Revolution, which, especially if you're on the, let's say, right of the political spectrum in Germany, you're terrified of. And this is where the German myth of the East and the Russian myth of Judeo-Bolshevism meet. So Judeo-Bolshevism is effectively this conspiracy theory worked up in the Russian Empire in the 1880s, 1890s, where Bolshevism, Marxism, socialism, was seen as a foreign conspiracy aimed at, creating chaos in the Russian Empire, led by sneaky Jews. Was there anti-Semitism in pre-war Germany? Yes, there was. But during the war, this trope of Judeo-Bolshevism and this notion that somehow the Jews in Eastern Europe are different from our Jews, right? Because German Jews were secular, Eastern European Jews less so. These tropes of the Ostjuden, this Jew as foreigner, this Jew as plague carrier, this Jew as communist agitator, as creator of chaos, starts to come in. And it comes in directly during the war because, the Germans keep fighting in the East after the war in the West ends. And a lot of these Germans, come in contact with far-right Russians who have copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and they're like, you don't like communism, you don't like communism, read this book, it will tell you everything you need to know about communism. So you have these anti-Semitic tropes that enter into the conversation. And these anti-Semitic tropes depict the sort of Eastern Jew as less than human. Notice our character in the film. It's not Bela Lugosi, it's not Christopher Lee, who are kind of attractive vampires, right? Homeboy in this is not attractive. Indeed, one critic referred to him as a penis with teeth. More about that in a second, too. He's animalistic, big ears, kind of dirty, long fingernails. If you look at propaganda pieces from the period of the foreign Bolshevik enemy, Count Orlok bears a disturbing resemblance. The other aspect, and I keep coming back to this, is sort of this notion of disease carrier. Disease in a very literal sense. In fact, Germans fighting on the Eastern Front during World War I referred to their ailments as Asiatic, the Asiatic syphilis. Right, it's not European syphilis. Once you get into like Ukraine or something, you're an Asian now. Right. So this notion of this sort of Ostjuden as plague carrier, and this is interesting too because this is the only version of Dracula that I'm aware of where you have mass death, but the plague and this notion of vampirism as literally this disease that's going to go into your well-ordered civilized domain and seriously screw it up appears. There's no other version where that's part of it. And then finally, there's kind of the set onset. Who has seen the most recent version of Nosferatu when it came out? Yeah, that one's a little bit more in your face. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about, so you have dangerous, plague carrying, Jewish communists effectively from the East. But there's also, and this is also in Stoker as well, so this isn't just the film, there's this sort of dangerous sexual element, right? Because the vampire isn't just coming to ruin your society, bring this pestilence. He's here to sleep with your women. And let's rip off the Band-Aid, it's rape. And so the film bears a lot, it speaks to a lot of these anxieties. In the first year of the war, when the Russian army actually invades East Prussia, German propaganda is full of this, the Cossacks are coming, and they're going to take your women. Right, that is the big thing, It's not just this political danger, it's also these are these savage people from the steppes who are going to come destroy your civilization. And they're going to take your women too, because that's what uncivilized peoples do. So this film speaks to these anxieties, very real anxieties within German culture in the immediate aftermath of World War I, which, if you divorce the film from the war, doesn't really make very much sense, right? And so I think the World War I not only created the modern horror film in a very literal way, it also informed specific national genre cinema, right? The American films look different from the German films and vice versa. I had some more quotes, but we have no light. So I kind of, I winged it the best I could, gang. Do you good people have any questions?
That was great.
I do what I can. I do what I can. Yes, my man.
Do you think the fact that he's a Count Orlok and he's the only kind of aristocrat in the whole movie?
My fucking yes. So that's key. Now in in Stoker's novel, that's played up even more because even though Britain is a monarchy, but let's be clear. Since the Glorious Revolution, the Queen and King of England do nothing. They exist.
I think
they-
he's a plant.
Yeah, they exist so that you Americans can buy shit. Literally. So, in the British sense of Britishness, we are a nation of shopkeepers and we do it by the rule of law. Once you go to the East, and that East could be India, that East could be China, that East could be Eastern Europe, that's when these dastardly Oriental despots, these dictator men, that's where they live. And so what you just said, I think, is really key here. And in the German context, perhaps not so much, but there's definitely this, we have modernity, we have a Kaiser, we do elections, we live in towns. You go right across the border into like Russian Poland, they have aristocrats, they still have feudalism, and again, in this film, but also in the novel itself, and there's a line in the novel where it's literally, I'm taking the train, we have a Hungarian in the house, out of Budapest, and I'm leaving the civilized West and entering the more backward East. And the backward East is this land of no democracy, no human rights. People, live in peasant hovels. And even too, I brought up the anti-Semitic tropes. Even German Jewish veterans during the war who served in the East looked at their fellow Jews and they were like, what the hell are you? It's like I've taken a time machine back to what we used to be. Right, we speak German, we go to the synagogue, but you guys, you all have like the hats, you speak Yiddish, which we haven't spoken in 100 years. It's like looking at a time machine and going backward. So the fact that the character's an aristocrat, I think is very important here because the idea is we in the civilized West, we don't do feudalism anymore, but in the East, they still do these things. So yeah, I think that's very important. Very important.
All the townsfolk are kind of like these merchants.
Yeah, it's literally you have these feudal peasants who assumably live on Count Orlok's land because that's how feudalism kind of works, who are like in this cycle of backwardness, and then you have this evil, despotic, feudal, land baron up in the castle. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's right.
And that thought process, how the Germans did not like the people from the East, particularly the Russians, that continued well into the Second World War.
That is a driving force for the Second World War, and maybe that's an important point said unsaid here. For Germans, World War I really doesn't end in 1918.
Right.
When America, France, and Britain, they're making horror films too, but they're also erecting memorials to the dead. In the 20s and 30s, the Germans aren't doing that because they're like, the war isn't over yet. And the East and these stereotypes, well, we see where this goes. I mean, this is part and parcel with, National Socialism and the rise of Hitler, and most ordinary Germans weren't full-on Nazis, but if you ask most ordinary Germans, how do you feel about Ukrainians? They would sound a lot like straight-up Nazis, Maybe we don't kill all of them in a genocidal colonial war, but that land should be ours, right? Because we have culture and they don't.
They don't.
Yes. Zach.
So most horror movies are set in like a kind of fictional version of like where that culture is done its most harm. So like we set ours in sleepaway camps or abandoned cabins because of the frontier. In England they do it all in like dark cities because of the Dickensian era. But like German Expressionism, where does that take place?
That's okay. So there's two parts to your question. So in the case of this film, it's a fictitious German town,
Right.
at some point in the 19th century, and it's Transylvania, but it's really this orientalized, mythic Transylvania. But in terms of German Expressionism sort of style. This, I think, goes back to that first quote I had, because the Germans didn't just sort of create horror film; they also kind of created modern cinema. And so World War I blew away everything. So when the Germans get cameras after the war, they just experiment. They just do it, and it's very interesting. German film and Soviet film, again, this revolutionary experience of war, they're doing the coolest stuff cinematically in the 1920s and 1930s. Like the camera can freaking move. In Hollywood, the camera didn't move for a while. And so, you know, where does this sort of come from? Where is this? It's coming out of the war in this distorted version of reality. Yes, young man.
I'll tell you. Listen, I pretend to be Count Dracula. I just pretend because I pretend to be Dracula. I mean horror film. I go to my castle and I be a fan. I be a vampire because I was started by because I just started by because I made a movie from horror film movies.
Okay. All right.
And young men, I will say this: when I was your age, I also I also, if there was a creature from the universe of genre that I would be, it would be a vampire, because they got all the women. Let's be real, right? Like, so there are benefits.
I don't know, I think Frankenstein got one or two, too.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you again, Paul. Thank you all for coming out. Two recommendations if you want to read more about, again, what I was saying. David Scull's The Horror Show, which is cheap, and William H. Poole's Wasteland, which is literally all about the connection between World War I and
I've heard about that one, yeah.
Excuse me?
Was there another silent movie you mentioned?
I don't believe.
The French is actually dead.
Oh, Jacques Hughes. There's two versions of it. One's from 1919, and then the same director remade it in 1936. Yeah, it's kind of the first zombie movie. It's
great.
Yeah, it's really.
Check that out. Thank you all for coming. This is the last lecture in the series. We're going to return this back in April. You can sign up for our newsletter to learn more about upcoming events. We're going to have
a lecture in the winter.
or a quiz thing, I don't know. But
We just need to get to the end of this.
our next definite event will be Sunday, December 21st. We're hosting a the Delco Winter Social Fundraiser, the Warehouse 3 in Swarthmore, and it's going to feature Joe Jack Talcum. So come on out, it'll be a
This
good
is going to be
time.
similar to the one you guys did last year around the
Yeah,
holidays?
oh yeah, but just
Okay, cool.
much better. We'll have Joe Jack Talcum.
All right.
Come on out. Thanks for coming out, guys. Get him safely.